This episode is brought to you by Progressive. Progressive helps you compare direct auto rates from a variety of companies so you can find a great one, even if it's not with them. Quote today at Progressive.com to find a rate that works with your budget. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, May 14th, 1958, Vice President Richard Nixon is on an 18-day goodwill tour of South America. And when he reaches Caracas, Venezuela, things take a violent turn. Angry crowds inflamed by anti-American sentiment protesting U.S. policies surrounded Nixon's motorcade and unleashed a barrage of rocks and other objects. Nixon's trip had been a rocky one. In some countries, it was kind of your typical diplomatic stuff, calm and a little stuffy. And then in others, it was much more chaotic, but nothing quite like what happened in Venezuela. Broken glass and flying rocks and the car being surrounded and lots more. So let's talk about the attack on Nixon in Caracas, 1958, the larger context and the aftermath. Here, as always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Taking one big step back and referring to an episode we did fairly recently, we talked a little bit about how coming out of World War II and heading into the height of the Cold War, Europe had the Marshall Plan, and Latin America never really had a kind of sense, at least in terms of U.S. foreign policy and support, a sense of like, this is a concerted effort to how we're going to approach this region. And there were efforts to do that, and they never really coalesced for a bunch of reasons. But it feels like that's the larger context here for why Nixon is on this goodwill, so to speak, tour. A real sense that Latin America is a huge geopolitical pawn, player, force, something in the looming, emerging red versus blue game of risk that is geopolitics in the 50s and 60s.
I mean, basically anything between 1950 and 1990 is defined by this obsessive offensive against communism. And in places like Africa and South America and Central America and Asia, there's this idea that you're either going to go commie or you're going to be on the U.S.'s side. The Marshall Plan was at least in part about trying to shore up support for a U.S. alliance and for democracies in Europe. And so now you have the Eisenhower administration looking down at Central and South America and saying, okay, how are we going to make sure these guys stay on our side? And that's basically the question the U.S. is asking for most of those 40 years.
Yeah, the terrified domino effect. If one goes, they all go. And so if someone gets a foothold, that's the end of the game.
Yeah.
And so always sort of like making sure that these leaders, particularly in South America, are playing on the side of the Americans. I mean, that becomes sort of like the common narrative is that whoever comes into power has to be someone who's willing to play along with the United States. And so you get a lot of these puppet dictators. You get a lot of these American sympathetic leaders. And they're not always operating in the best interest of the people. And so it causes quite a bit of tension and even outright violence in terms of the political landscape.
Yeah.
And to throw one other thing in, just recall that the U.S. also felt a real ownership over the Western Hemisphere. And so the kind of meddling that the U.S. government does in these governments to shore up certain governments, to overthrow others, is particularly intense in this region because of, more than a century of a belief that the U.S. should control the region.
Yeah. And I mean, just in your one sentence there, right, you used the phrase meddling, shore up, control, support, right? And somewhere in there is, I don't think the U.S. has displayed a real understanding of the nuances of the lines between all of those things over the years, but somewhere in there, and we talked about this when we did that episode, this was under Kennedy a few years later, but, where we did that episode about the sort of talk of a goodwill support for Latin America, there is some genuine economic support, but then that so often then bleeds into meddling, propping up dictatorships, CIA involvement, and so forth. And so that is all swirling in this moment. So this goodwill tour gets put together to, basically Eisenhower cooks up this idea to send Nixon down there to basically demonstrate U.S. commitment and support for the region. A lot of it is related to the fact that there had been a lot of instability in the commodity markets. A lot of these economies were sort of teetering on the edge throughout Latin America. And so I think they saw, oh gosh, there's fears here that a lot of these democracies in South America might turn in a different direction. So Nixon puts together a trip to 18 different countries, basically every independent country in South America except for Brazil and Chile, whose leaders were out of town apparently at the time that he was going to visit, and said, no, it's not worth coming back to greet you. Uruguay, Argentina, Paraguay, Bolivia, Peru, Ecuador, Colombia. Venezuela is the sort of last one on this tour. They often are pretty warm visits, but then there is a sort of ratcheting up of tensions as the trip goes on. And there's a little more personal attacks, some violence, a little bit of protests in like Montevideo, for instance. And in Peru, there are some troubles. And then he kind of has this moment where he meets with students and chats with them. And then some stones get thrown and so forth. But nothing compares to what happens in Caracas when he arrives towards the end of this trip in May. There's the big geopolitical context, and then there's always the local context. I think that's obviously important here. What is it about Venezuela itself that we understand in this moment that led people to be so upset with Nixon? And then I want to sort of talk specifically about what happens. I mean, it's a sort of dramatic event, but
there's a lot of unrest and turmoil in Venezuela in this period. Just a little earlier that year, we're talking here April, May, earlier that year, the Venezuelan dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez had been overthrown in a popular uprising. He'd gone into exile to the United States. So there is this sense that the United States was helping out this deposed dictator who the Venezuelans had gotten rid of. And it wasn't clear what kind of government was going to take the dictatorship's place. There was a military junta that was put into place as a kind of caretaker government. But this is a particularly fragile time for Venezuela. Tensions are running quite high, but also the future of Venezuela's government is at stake. And so both the U.S. has a real interest in this, but also local communist leaders have a big interest in what happens next for Venezuela. And that, I think, is what helps fuel this showdown.
Interested in the forces shaping our world? The Council on Foreign Relations has you covered. For those who like to look ahead, dive into The World Next Week, hosted by Bob McMahon and Carla Ann Robbins.
We were not forecasting anything about Russian domestic upheaval, and yet that has been the story of the week.
These are scorpions going after each other in a bottle.
And for those who want to go beyond the headlines, join Jim Lindsay as he opens up the president's inbox.
What should U.S. policy do?
The approach towards China, it's enough to make me question bipartisanship.
And finally, join me, Gabrielle Sierra, on Why It Matters, as my guests and I bring some of the world's most compelling stories home to you.
Do you feel good about where we're heading with AI?
Maybe we need to invent a new word here, which kind of is a combination of frightened and excited. I'm excited.
So what are you waiting for?
For the world next week, the president's inbox.
And Why It Matters. We'll see you soon.
And it's interesting because the CIA, the ambassador to the country, they basically tell Nixon, now might not be a good time to show up. I don't know if you should actually get on that plane. But he does show up. And when he does, this is what I love about the 20th century as opposed to the 19th century. In the 20th century, there's footage, right? So you can actually see, the crowds swarming the airport, swarming, his motorcade. And it is unreal. I don't think we will ever see another vice president sort of experience what Nixon experienced going to Venezuela.
Yeah. So he gets off the plane and immediately, there's just crowds and crowds of people there. Things feel a little off. They get to the cars. He's supposed to go and lay a wreath at the tomb of Simón Bolívar, but basically they realize the crowds are already there waiting for him. So they decide to go straight to the U.S. embassy. But even along that trip, there's crowds are engulfing the car, banging on the windows with their fists. Pretty quickly, U.S. Secret Service agents come to think that his life might be in jeopardy. They draw their firearms. It gets tense. Glass starts flying. Windows are broken. An army officer later recounts having, quote, a mouthful of glass as things were just sort of getting heated. It is interesting that Nixon was traveling in a closed-top car as opposed to a convertible, which was sort of the standard, and we know a few years later was the standard. That in many ways may have been the thing that sort of saved him in this case, is that he was in a closed car.
Right, because this crowd was out to get him, right? Yes. Like the idea here was that there was now a representative of U.S. power present there, and the crowd was unleashing its anger at the motorcade. As you mentioned, Jody, you know, some of the windows were broken in other cars in the motorcade. Rosemary Woods, who would later become very famous during Watergate for her mismanagement of the tape recordings, was actually there. She had been Nixon's secretary for quite some time, and she ends up injured by all of the flying glass. And there was a real possibility that people were going to witness a vice president being assassinated to death in the streets.
Killed. Killed.
So it's a little unclear how it sort of wraps up. There's reports that sometimes that maybe they got a huge truck to just sort of plow a path for him, or maybe, you know, local police stepped up and Nixon finally basically just cancels the rest of his events. It's like a 12-minute melee that takes place as he's leaving the airport. Gets to the embassy, basically cancels the events, and basically leaves the next morning. One interesting thing that happens the next morning is things are pretty calmed down. I believe that overnight the U.S. basically mobilized tons of troops from the Caribbean to basically come down and stand there and just secure the area. So now there's this huge sort of police presence as Nixon makes his way back to the airport. This was the final stop on the trip. He makes his way back to the United States. He lands in the U.S., and there's footage of this too. And there's huge crowds there greeting him as someone who just survived this sort of harrowing moment. And, you know, clearly the sort of narrative turns as he comes back to the United States. I watched the newsreel about this incident, in particular his return to the United States. And, you know, the newsreel, no surprise, is like very 1950s, very sort of jingoistic, very pro-American, talking about sort of savage Latin American crowds. In it, it sort of has this line that says, like, the local Communist Party in Venezuela bust in demonstrators to attack our vice president. And, you know, that sounds like it's the kind of line, it sounds like rhetoric. That actually probably was kind of true. Like, I think the local Communist Party did sort of say, hey, this guy's here. Like, let's send a message.
What you doing this afternoon? Let's get on the bus.
But it is interesting how it gets framed back in the U.S. And then moreover, and this is kind of where I'm curious about your final thoughts here, but moreover, it clearly leaves a huge impression on Nixon himself. How does he talk about this in the wake of it? And what is our sense, just knowing what Nixon goes on to do, of how this shapes him?
It has a big impact on Nixon. He writes this very famous book called Six Crises. It's his first book of many that he would write over the course of his life. But this attack was listed as one of those crises that he had to navigate in order to prepare himself for eventually becoming the president. But I think when we think about the impact on Nixon, Nixon was already a committed Cold Warrior. He'd been an anti-communist. He'd been part of HUAC. He's part of all of the House Un-American Activities Committee. He has all of that experience. But I think it shapes the way that he sees Latin America as a kind of ungovernable region that requires military instead of political force to leverage U.S. power. And when we start to think about all of the wars that the U.S. helps to support or initiate or extend in Latin America in the 1970s and 1980s, you have to think about the role that this incident plays on the way that Nixon understands South America.
Yeah, I couldn't echo that anymore. I think that's spot on. And I do think that, I think the narrative that's constantly shaped in the United States about South American governments being either corrupt or inept, and all of these ideas, I think, get funneled through that experience as well.
Yeah. I mean, you know, within a couple of years, the U.S. is identifying Yankee phobia as a key challenge in the region. And Nixon himself, you know, he was already probably pretty racist going into this, but, you know, he comes out of it. And, you know, there's reports later in tape of him talking about Latin America, as you said, you know, Latin Americans as savage and unruly. And he basically said that all of Latin America, except for Colombia, was too immature for democratic rule or whatever. So, yeah.
No, Colombia kept him in,
I suppose. Yes, exactly. All right. Well, we will leave it there with that incident of Nixon in Caracas. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
On another continent 4,650 miles away, in Venezuela, hostility rears its vilifying head. The vice president of a good neighbor is lampooned. Brewing is the most violent attack ever perpetrated on a high American official while on foreign soil. Rocks, eggs, debris. Several in the party are injured as both the vice president and Mrs. Nixon's cars are pelted and spat upon. Visit to Venezuela is cut short. Vigilant guards set up a formidable protection shield. But always the vice president reflects calm rather than concern after his turbulent experience.
Radiotopia from P